Chuckabutties, this video is somewhat longer than normal, discussing equity and spotlight. But do stick with us please till the end and let us know what you think. Thank you.
Nigel.cecil, calling things out as you like it, especially for his fair-minded friends.
Hello Chuckabutties, welcome. Thank you for joining me, Nigel.cecil, and of course assisted, as I invariably am, by my very good friend Hilary. This video relates to equity. Equity, the trade union for professional actors, variety entertainers and other creatives across the United Kingdom, and it raises some questions. Here are the questions, and then we'll explain what it's all about if you haven't already guessed from the caption. No clear winners. Is it worth the risk? An opportunity for you to decide about that risk, and then the possible outcomes. We are referring to a headline that was in The Stage magazine recently. Quick interjection, Nigel. The Stage is a newspaper, not a magazine. End of interjection. An article, an opinion written by Alistair Smith. The headlines were No Clear Winners. And that was relating to equity, bringing a High Court action against Spotlight, the home of casting. Now, in previous videos, we've discussed these issues. We've sort of mentioned that if you're proceeding to High Court, when some of our equitable friends were involved with the Equity Council, and indeed some of them were officers, they were always advised, unless you had at least 70% chance of winning, the legal advice hopefully would say 80%, then it was probably the wiser course of action not to proceed to the High Court. So now we're going to summarize some of the details, and of course we don't claim to be right, it's just our observations, our thoughts, chatting with other equity members. But it'll put things into your domain and you can actually decide. And if you see something where we've misspoken or misshown, please get in touch and let us know. And we'll endeavour to correct everything as soon as we can, at least in the video notes. So what's it all about? And of course, no clear winners. Is it worth the risk? An opportunity for you to decide. And what are the outcomes? Well, Spotlight's been going for years and years and years. Spotlight, the home of casting. Anyone involved in the entertainment biz, showbiz, will know all about it. In fact, are we right, Hilary? It actually started before equity started. Now, back in the day, governments brought in legislation to protect workers. And when push comes to shove, whilst we might be performers, celebrities, stars, or a jobbing actor, we're workers. And so this legislation came in at the turn of the century that said, well, you can't charge more than a fair whack, or indeed in some cases you can't charge for finding work for workers. That was the responsibility of the employers, or things like that. And so these regulations were brought in. And at that time, equity supported an exemption for Spotlight because they said, well, it's completely different. It's a casting directory. And if you bring these sort of issues into Spotlight, it's going to completely mix up what it's all about. But recently, equity had a look at it. And indeed, it opens a can of worms, does it, Hilary? Because Alistair Smith highlights the fact that maybe there's a subplot, is there? Because Matt Hood, now the managing director of Spotlight, for some 17 years worked at Equity, a valued member of staff known to many members of Equity, and ended up becoming an assistant general secretary. So one would have thought when Matt Hood moved to become managing director of Spotlight, they would be fully aware of what Spotlight should be delivering for Equity members and also what equity members believed Spotlight should deliver for them. Now, Equity's been saying, well, of course, Spotlight now has a monopoly. It's so big, and the other casting directories, they don't compare. So having to be in Spotlight and paying your subscription fees was a tax on hope. A wonderful phrase. I mean, if anyone says, do you want to campaign against a tax on hope? Of course we do. We join the entertainment profession and we're all hopeful of getting work, whether we come, well, the straight route by just getting a job or going through drama school and getting some qualification. At any one time, some 80% of Equity members are out of work looking for work. So we need, well, to have hope. Take away that hope and we're just, well, fading away. I'm digressing, aren't I, Hillary? I do this all the time. I just ramble off. I do apologise in my old age. But anyway, no clear winners. Was it worth the risk? And you decide. So the stage is actually saying they were there. There were no clear winners in the arguments for and against. But when it comes to the risk, was there a case for Spotlight to answer? So what we did, we looked at the legislation as best as we could and just picked a couple of points. Because what the problem seems to be is Spotlight an employment agency? Because that's when it all kicks in. That's when it really all kicks in. So we'll put this on the screen. Put this on, yes, Hillary, and I've got it down here because I'm going to have to read it to be sure I've got it right. On the screen, highlighting the two particular points Hillary and Y used on your behalf to try and determine whether Equity were justified in bringing their High Court action against Spotlight, not least because, win or lose, it's possible that Equity's money, your money, could incur thousands of pounds of costs. So that's why we're asking the question, what's the percentage chances of Equity winning? And of course, that opinion by Alistair Smith, who was there for the court hearing, said there were no clear winners. And once again, a reminder, we've always been told, unless you are assured by your legal advice that you've got more than a 70-80% chance of winning, don't proceed to the High Court. Of course, Equity may have already got that advice from their solicitors, their lawyers, their barristers, because that could be in the confidential minutes of Equity. It's not available to Equity members. But we're digressing again, aren't we, Hillary? These particular points, well, the first one, they apply to employment agencies. There is an argument about Spotlight being a business, but again, similar considerations apply. So the first one, employment agencies. If you run an employment agency, you aren't responsible for paying a work seeker after you've introduced them to a hirer. Well, that applies to Spotlight, doesn't it? They aren't responsible for that, but did they introduce them to a hirer? What does the word introduce mean? Does it mean you physically have to say to the hirer, hello, may I introduce Nigel.cecil? Or does it mean, well, it's a casting directory, and that casting directory introduces everyone, does it? But anyway, the second point, employment agencies find work for work seekers who are employed and paid by employers. The key word there, find work for work seekers. Does Spotlight actually find work for work seekers? Because do they ring you up and say, we found you some work? Do they get in touch and say, Nigel, we've got a job for you? No, they just publish a directory. So you could say, well, that is finding work. But if that is finding work, then how do other people, workers finding work, justify things like this? Because this is a regular magazine that is pushed through our letterboxes and probably throughout the country at least once a month. And it's paid for by the job seekers, plumbers, electricians, plasterers, paying just for a very small advert some £45 a month. So they are paying to find work. But does this magazine fall into employment agencies? No. And indeed, when you think about it, when it gets near to Christmas, well, children's entertainers, magicians, party givers, they advertise in magazines like this. And would you, as the recipient of the magazine, dream of saying, well, we'll pay for that magazine to be pushed through our door? No, you'd probably say, don't bother. When I want to find somebody, I will actively search. Quick interjection, Nigel. Casting directories in print format, surely it's all about the websites. Yes, it is indeed. But is it any cheaper to maintain a fully functioning interactive website? How much does it cost? And how many staff are required? End of interjection. So is there a correlation between what those magazines are doing, in that the worker is trying to find work, because it's not the magazine trying to find work, is it? So does Spotlight actually try to find work? Now we've dropped our sheet on the floor. Do forgive us while I pick it up. Live entertainment. Yes. The second bit, it goes on there, well, of that second phrase, is that different rules apply to entertainment and modelling. However, different rules apply. Hang on a minute. Is that now the law? So if there is a ruling in the High Court to say equity is an employment agency, what are these different rules? As I say, when you go back to the turn of the century, equity supported these different rules. So unless you change the law, doesn't that mean the ruling in the High Court might say, well, yes, you're right, but now you need to use this to justify a change in the law? But then would the change in the law apply to other areas of work seekers? And they would say, oh, no, we're not having that when it comes to casting directories, magazines push through your door once a month. Now, to make it fair, we generated something from artificial intelligence, and we just tapped in, is Spotlight an employment agency? And guess what? It came back and said, yes, have a read. Yes, Spotlight aims to help its members, both performers and agents, find work. Spotlight acts as a casting directory connecting actors with casting professionals. Hang on a minute. So on the face of it, it says Spotlight aims to help its members find work. Well, is aiming to help the same as finding work? We can all assist someone, but it would appear from that phrase, if you analyse it, it's the responsibility of the worker to find the work. Casting directory, Spotlight are just a tool to help them to do it, and they can decide whether to pay for that tool or not bother. Okay, it's got a monopoly. But then a push comes to shove again. What happens if equity wins outright? It wins outright. But unintended outcomes, unintended consequences. This information is taken from Spotlight's website. Spotlight joins leading casting technology provider Talent Systems to create an unparalleled global network. So if equity were to succeed in their action 100%, and Spotlight were told that their business finance model was no longer possible within the United Kingdom, would Spotlight simply uproot and start running their global network casting directory from America? Something one needs to consider unintended consequences. But the summary for you to decide: was equity correct in bringing the High Court action? Was it good use of members' money? What was the risk involved? One thing that is clear: there is an argument to be put by equity, an argument that says, well, Spotlight, the way they are operating, is a tax on hope. And if we can do something about it, that will benefit all equity members. But is that approach sustainable when they go to the High Court and you consider all the options available for professionals? So there we are. That's a summary. A video a little bit longer than normal, but do let us know what you think. Should equity have taken the risk? You decide. Do let us know. Get in touch by our usual email address, And until the next time, good work, good art, and in showbiz, better keep your fingers crossed. And let's all hope you get the casting work you hope for and deserve. Fingers crossed. Please hit the subscribe button and join us again, because together every viewer helps. Thank you.